Hi, and welcome to another podcast episode of The Village ZM. During the month of October, we are talking history. Zambian history to be precise. History solely focused on our people and what led to this common identity we have. Being Zambian means more than just citizenship. Tuck your buds in and discover something new about our people.
One who Zambia, one who nation. One who Zambia, one who nation. One who Zambia, one who nation.
Okay, let's go. Count down for me, bro.
Count down from what? From 10, from 5, from 100?
No, count down from 3, bro.
From 3?
Mm-hmm.
All right, bro. Which way is down, first of all? All right. No, let Zangi do the count. Let Zangi do the count.
Okay.
Okay, in 3, 2, and 1.
What's good, everybody? Welcome to another episode of The Village ZM and our second week of Zambia History Month. Today, we are doing part 2 of our Anthropology of Zambia segment. And in the first part, we talked a lot from the prehistoric era, going all the way to Bantu migration and settlement. And today, we are going from Colonial Era to the present day. So, yeah, I know a lot of our younger listeners will relate more with this era, but it's actually been very interesting to just see the build-up of everything from the prehistoric era and just see how we still have some certain patterns in our culture in present day, from even as far as the Broken Hill Man. It's actually wild, if you ask me. So, yeah. So if I were you, after this episode, I would go and listen to the previous episode on one of our podcast platforms. Over to you, Suwi.
All right. Just to get started where we left off, Zangi is back with us this week again. So yeah, I'm super excited to be having this conversation once more. And yeah, we're just gonna pick up where we left off, which is going into the colonial era. And I'm gonna ask Zangi to sort of introduce this period to us a little bit, just to get us started off.
Okay, hi guys. Thanks for having me. Super excited for part 2. Yeah, so let's dive right in. So we're starting with the colonial era, and basically this just describes the period before independence. We're talking about 1870 to 1963, 64 if you want. And this is just a period that describes a time when Zambia was colonized by the British state. So basically, that's what we're talking about to begin with in this part. So yeah.
Okay, awesome. Well, so one thing that we know about, colonialism is there's two separate types of colonialism that are typically categorized as. One of them is settler colonialism. Think like the Americans, Australia, New Zealand, and that sort of thing, where, a group of people move in and they actually settle there. And then another category is what I call exploitative colonies, which are colonies that are set up to extract, resources, labor. And this is where our country, Zambia, falls. And, one of the key, I guess, agents of colonialism in our region is John Cecil Rhodes. I mean, of John Cecil Rhodes. And the British South Africa Company. So these are some of the things that we're going to try to get into and talk about, because, the BSAC set up, an extensive network of extractive economies to just, exploit resources, particularly, mineral rights in our region and stuff like that. And I think it's also worth noting the role of, European missionaries in perpetuating this. They're in a way, I consider them to be the precursor of colonialism I don't know what you think about that, Zangi.
Definitely. I mean, we really cannot talk about, colonialism without making mention of the fact that missionaries were definitely, what you said, precursors to this period. So really what we have is the policy of imperialism stretching across Africa. So we're talking about how, for instance, European countries, came up and just decided that they were going to extend their policies, their influence, over African countries. And so it's really important to note that when it comes to how they did this and how they eventually managed to colonize most of Africa, of course, except Ethiopia and Liberia, which were like settlement areas after the slave trade, it's really cardinal that we remember that missionaries were the earlier agents that were used before active colonialism actually started taking place. And so even when you start getting into John Cecil Rhodes, he comes right after the missionaries because the missionaries had already set up the stage to make colonialism pretty straightforward, or if you want, easy for the Europeans, So they're definitely the people that we have to mention as agents of imperialism and colonialism before you talk about people like John Cecil Rhodes and BSA Company. So,
okay. Yeah, that's definitely quite an interesting note. So what's the first step of Zambia becoming essentially a British colony? Well, it was titled a British protectorate. But how did this start? Where did it begin?
I think, it can really be traced, like in the 1900s, because already, again, we've noted the remarkable work of different missionaries, right? And so, like, when the BSA Company came into play, you're talking about 1890 to be specific, when actually Cecil Rhodes finally manages to sign the concession, the Lewanika, the Lochner Treaty.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, you're talking about 1890.
Zangi.
Yeah.
Zangi.
Hello.
Sorry, you had cut out just on the part where you mentioned the Lochner Treaty. So could you just step back and just start from there, just so we get it good on the record?
Oh, okay. Yeah. So I was saying that when it comes to direct, colonization of Zambia, we note the 1890 concession that was signed between the BSA Company under Cecil Rhodes and Lewanika, who was the king of the Lozi people. So we have the Lochner Treaty bringing Zambia in direct, colonization of these people. And that's really the beginning. And so fast forward to John Cecil Rhodes extending his influence, not only in this country, but Zimbabwe as well as South Africa. So now you talk about how he starts to, partition these areas, under the BSA Company. And so eventually Northern Rhodesia is ruled in two separate parts. So we have Northeastern Rhodesia and Northwestern Rhodesia. And then fast forward to 1924, when these two just became one single entity, becoming Northern Rhodesia. And so this is actually when the BSA Company now gives over power, their administrative, authority to the British government entirely, so that Northern Rhodesia becomes a protectorate, a British protectorate, which again is different from how Zimbabwe, and South Africa were colonized, because they had like a more severe type of, colonization compared to us, who are like a protectorate. And so there's quite a distinction between Zambia being a British protectorate and these other two countries, for instance, which were really colonies. There's a slight difference in terms of the definition and even the attention that was given to, Zambia compared to Southern Rhodesia and Zimbabwe in that sense.
Okay. Yeah, that's very insightful. And I feel like it's worth mentioning, that when Barotse landed negotiating for protectorate status from the British, Lewanika enlists a French missionary, Francois Coya or Francis Coylard.
Yeah.
And so this is very interesting, just tying back to the point that I brought in earlier about how missionaries were the precursor to colonialism. Exactly. And we're also, key agents in sustaining this colonialism.
Yeah, that is true.
So, thought that was worth mentioning. Please carry on.
Yeah, so, it was really a crazy time because we have these people introducing a new religion to Africans. And the fact that the Lozi kingdom, in our country, Zambia, was such a dominant kingdom. So when this missionary, Francois, managed to actually have Lewanika, sign off the mineral rights to the BSA company, I think this was a big deal. I think when I'm talking to students about this particular beginning of colonialism, I joke about how if, for instance, the Lozi king had been a little bit resistant, it would have delayed our country being colonized. But, when they managed to do that, it was more like over for the rest of Zambia, because even though other kingdoms tried to resist, it being such a dominant kingdom in the country made it pretty easy for them to now fight these other kingdoms. And in the end, the other kingdoms also had to give in, because of the missionary influence again. And that was really how they used it, because the missionaries were sent before, like a cover up, So they are talking all these, interesting things. You're talking to people who are not learned, they're not literate as well. So the idea of something new, let's not forget the fact that the Africans were being given new items. This is the first time they're coming into contact with material, with guns and all these things. And so they're so fascinated and ignorant of the fact that there's a bigger dominion that's coming up, and which was eventual colonization. Because honestly, I think if we think about it, when we talk about the concession itself, safe to say that, this guy did not know how to read, because why would you give away? Why would you sell off your mineral rights to the whole land if you actually have that knowledge of what you're doing? But they really preyed on the ignorance of the African kings or the African chiefs in such a way, and eventually managed to colonize our country.
Yes, that's a very interesting point to note about the concessions, about the treaties, because, one of the key, and it's been very controversial, especially as it relates to Barotse land, because, the concession that's granted for mineral rights to the BCAC, it talks of, a very poorly defined region that extends, all the way into present day Copperbelt, which isn't, it isn't under the Lozi kingdom. That's Lamba land. So it's a very interesting way. But another very important thing that I think we should also be considering is, especially given, the context of missionaries as the precursor, it's a very manipulative process. Because I remember, thinking about it one time, I was having a conversation with a few friends, and I was thinking to myself, if Lewanika says no, Letunga Lewanika says no, I'm not going to sign this. The next thing is probably a bullet to his head, and then the next person is then made to sign. So it's a very manipulative process, and I think it's very important to understand that this violence that characterizes colonialism isn't just physical; it's also mental manipulation.
Exactly. Yeah, that is true. I totally agree. You're right.
Yeah, so that's just something. But anyway, let's move a little bit more into, because we don't want to get too political. The political segment will come. I want to focus on the anthropology, the study of people, the study of human. And so could you just give us a little bit of insight? What was the colonial period like for indigenous people, the native Zambians?
I think it's a difficult question to answer, just to describe, because you're talking about, people who have an aim. They know what they're doing in this particular time. And then you're also talking about the indigenous people, obviously, who are, receiving an influx of these Europeans at once into their land, and everything is just new to them, So obviously there's mistreatment, which is crazy, because sometimes when you see new people, obviously you think, these people are new, so how are we going to, get by, how are we going to interact and things like that. But then these Africans are suppressed, to a point that they are mistreated in their own land. I think that was really crazy for people who are there at that time, because I'm sure with, the new material that they were seeing these Europeans come with, they they thought, okay, this is an upgrade. But then there were all those limitations, and things that you can't just have this. It isn't for free, So now it brings about fear and so many things, because fast forward to, colonialism, it brought so much, like among the people in Zambia, for instance. Now there was a lot of suspicion. So you can imagine people are in the eastern part of northern Rhodesia, and then the western side has been conquered, and when people start experiencing the harsh treatment and whatnot, I think it was bound to bring about this division compared to the unity, because obviously people were coexisting, knowing, okay, there are people in the western side, there are people on the copper belt and whatever. Of course, those boundaries not significantly named, but people just there was that unity. But I think with colonialism, I think what started to happen is people just being suspicious of one another, disunity that obviously would override that period, so much so that even post-independence, people now had to carry that disunity, because of the treatment that they got in that period. So what do you think?
Yeah, it's very interesting. It's very interesting to sort of unpack and analyze. On the one hand, I think it's the tragedy of humanity that we suffered from, because taking us a little bit back into the last segment, historically you have people from a foreign land and they're friendly and you assimilate. Right, that's what happened. The Bantu come into this land and they find, the Khoisan and the Twa, and for the most part, it's cordial relations, and they assimilate. They they live together in harmony for the most part. And so, I guess this era sort of blurs the line between that human essence and naivety. Because you don't expect that the next person intends to harm you. You expect that they don't have an evil intention. Yeah. It's a very tragic thing to think about in that sense for me. But just to maybe, I suppose, draw some context from that and move into our struggle for independence. One of the key steps in our independence struggle was, of course, African churches that had been set up. And welfare associations and it happened through several waves. So could you talk us through a little bit of this, just as we divert into the independence struggle?
Okay, so it's very, I think this topic really is just so wide. It is so fascinating to unpack, honestly, because we're seeing how the missionaries are the precursors of colonialism. But then we also see the other effect, that came with missionary work in Central Africa, Zambia also, to be specific. Because when the missionaries came, if we talk about Livingstone, for instance, and how he emphasized on the 3 C's, 3 things that he really was about. And so you talk about how every time that a missionary society settled in an area, it had to come with a school, it had to come with a hospital, it had to come with a church. So now what this created was now an awareness, and we have Europeans obviously trying to put these Africans down, to control them and things like that. But then also we have the Africans getting an education and just being aware now of the rights, and they know this is not it. If you're giving us Christianity, which God is going to, tolerate this kind of treatment? And so now the effect on the Africans is that they want to rise up. And this is where we see primary resistance, which is the first stage of, trying to resist colonial rule. And this is, of course, where you bring about welfare associations or native associations. Now, the difference is, with the first group, the first stage of resistance to colonial rule, which involve welfare associations, we have the educated Africans, we also have African breakaway churches, very, very important in the struggle, because they as well set the tone for what was later to come. And so these people were not trying to be violent. They just said, hey, you know what? We want to have peace in our country. We want the welfare of Africans to be protected. We want our conditions to be improved because this is our country and things like that. So they were really not trying to be violent. And we can still equate that to how church institutions resolve conflict they're more on a subtle level. They're not going to come out at people like with force and whatnot, but they're going to appeal to your senses, to your moral, like, this is good and this is bad. But obviously, with more of this now, and obviously seeing that these people were not budging, now this is where secondary resistance was introduced, and we see political parties now forming up, of course, again, from, educated Africans, and they were not having it. So when it comes to secondary resistance, that was more violent because people knew that being soft in terms of wanting freedom, wanting their independence, wasn't going to happen if they took that route of primary resistance. And so secondary resistance brings about formation of political parties and just nationalist ideas and movements of people just wanting to be independent. So.
Okay, well, thank you so much for those insights. Just a quick note, just to clarify. So David Livingstone's 3 C's are Christianity, commerce, and civilization.
Yes.
And it's interesting because, these are the 3 C's of colonialism as well. This is what this is what they were trying to do. And there's actually this philosophy that's called, the white man's burden. And that's what colonialism is really about. So it's just interesting to just know about. Now, just to take us a few steps further, we've gone through these waves.
Yeah.
Obviously, we haven't gone into too much detail because we're trying to focus more on the bigger picture, the people picture. I'm sure that will be all discussed once we talk about our political history. But it's very interesting looking at, the Declaration of Independence. And one of the most fascinating things is, of course, Northern Rhodesia goes to the 1964 Olympics. And in the course of these Olympics, we have our Declaration of Independence on October 24th. And we have a new flag and a new name at the closing ceremony. I thought that was really interesting. Very
interesting. That's right. Very interesting fact, because we're the only country recorded to have changed names just between the opening and the closing ceremony of the Olympic Games. So pretty interesting fact.
Okay, yeah, that's definitely true. I mean, it's never happened before. So I thought that was really, a piece of history and a historic event that's, probably very unlikely to happen again.
Yeah.
But could you just give us before we move on to, into the contemporary space, could you just give us some closing thoughts on the colonial era? What's one key takeaway from this?
Well, basically, I think it's just the suppression of, like the African voice, and wanting to push an agenda that wasn't ours. Because for me, I feel like that has affected so much, of our development, to an extent that I think people, of course, we're trying to build based on that. But then again, there's some limitation. And, for me, it's crazy because I usually say the way colonialism worked for me, I think was really about the mental. And I feel like if you can control the mental aspect of somebody, that's it. It really takes so much for somebody to come out of it. And I feel like we don't talk about it so often, but in a way, to an extent, I feel like we're still colonized. You know what I mean? Because we have all these, remnants of the colonial period. You talk about education, talk about our language even. All those things are rooted in the effects of colonialism. And I mean, we're okay with where we are right now. But are we really free? Because there's so many people wanting to fit into the Western, standards of living and things like that. You talk about how perceptions have changed in terms of what makes you wealthy. Back in the day, it was probably you having like so many cows, property in terms of land, family, children, like that was wealth. But now everybody is all about, the hassle. Everybody is about, wanting the latest fashion and things like that. And it's a mind, it's a mind control kind of thing, because I think we've moved away from really recognizing like what was our way of doing things before that period, because now I think it's difficult to recognize, where we're coming from, because our history is somehow like clouded by, that period, because what slave trade did was, really focus. It was so much heavy, like on like physical, that evidence seeing people. But they came up and said, okay, fine. So slave trade is done. How are we going to control these people further? And when they came with changing the standards of living, changing, your perception of all these things, they were coming for the mind. And so the question really is, are we really free? Because, I think most of the things that we do are still rooted in that particular time and how effective they managed to control the African, narrative from that point, so much so that I think it has outlived that period. I think for me, that's my biggest, worry, my biggest, thought process around the colonial time. Of course, it's done, but there are so many effects from that time that are still evident today. And can we run away from that? How do we move forward, with those effects still being present today?
Yeah. And well, what you've mentioned is the perfect segue for our next segment, which talks about, contemporary history, which I've summed it into three main parts, which is coloniality, basically what you talked about. I'll define it in a moment. And then how we need to also have a conversation around decolonization and tribal fluidity as well, which is something that we meant in the previous segment when we talked about Bantu migrations. So I guess, one of the key things that I always keep in mind, there's this quote that says, "Know your history or be doomed to repeat its mistakes." And I think in our context, this is something that we always need to keep at the back of our mind.
Mm-hmm.
So, where do I begin? Okay. I just need to take a moment because I really don't like talking about this because it hits really close to home. Now, we've had our independence, political independence in inverted commas. And so, hard colonization is a thing of the past. But a place like Zambia, so many resources, we're still a battleground for influence.
Oh,
we have, the West trying to flex its muscles and influences. And we also have, the emerging powers in the East also doing the same thing.
Yeah.
So, this is something that's, it's familiar. It's like, like, where have we seen this movie before?
Yeah.
So yeah, it's something that really hits close to home when you think about it that way. But just to sort of define coloniality, as I mentioned before, it refers to, intangible patterns of power that emerged as a product of colonialism, especially when it relates to knowledge production and intersubjectivity relations. This is how it's defined. And there's a Peruvian sociologist. His name is Anibal Cuanjo. And he explains that we can identify coloniality through its desire to control authority, the economy, gender and sexuality, and knowledge and subjectivity. So, when you think of these things and list them out, it's basically intended to control the world as we know it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the blockade that stands between where we are today and going through the whole process of decolonization.
Yeah. So, do you think we're still going through that process of decolonization?
Oh, 100%, because the thing about decolonization as it is today is it's a very abstract concept. It's something that doesn't happen in, it doesn't happen in like a physical space. It requires us to basically rewire our brains and think of a different world.
Yeah, that's true. Like, think of how we do certain things as well, like what influences, our actions, which I think not so many people do. I think people now are just caught up in doing things without stopping to think, where am I getting this from? And I think that's another danger on its own,
Yeah, exactly. And there are a lot of things that we've come to now sort of accept as, this is just tradition. This is the way things are. And it's like, no, this is the way things were done during the colonial era.
Yeah.
You have to now start to unpack and look at, okay, what was our society like before colonization? And what is, what does our society look like if we determine it for ourselves?
Yeah.
And so, I guess one of the challenges that, decolonization faces is it's used as just like a metaphor for different things. Like, okay, no, we're decolonizing, where we have all these human rights based social justice projects and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And I speak on a lot of these things in my article. So if you're really interested in more depth on this, go check out that article for sure. It's on the Village ZM's Twitter. So yeah, just go check that article out. It gives a bit more depth to this. But just to summarize, decolonization asks us to transform our worldview. It asks us to dramatically reform society. Mm-hmm. Right? It's not like the next step in our evolution or whatever. It's a different direction completely. And that's what I feel like a lot of people need to start to understand in approaching it.
Yeah, definitely. Because we have like the young people, obviously, there's so many young people these days that, I think are just caught, and even if you have like a history lesson of Zambia, it's like, why are we learning this already? Because they are right here, and I think the comparison is with the Western world, because I think they're not drawing reference from their own country, it's not just Zambia. I feel like even other African countries might find themselves in this space, And again, that's the importance of knowing your history, because if you're just about going with the trend and whatnot, it's so easy to lose yourself, because I think you can adopt so many different things that are not your own. But when you really start to think about why certain things have happened, and looking at our country, for instance, why certain systems are still failing and all that, like, then the individual now can start to take it up upon, themselves to try to make a difference. But I think if you're okay with, this is how it's been, and you're not trying to investigate how things could be better, and think about a time before the colonial, period, I think it makes it very difficult to actually want to move, in a country that sees things like move forward, and like there's so much dependence on like a Western perspective, which shouldn't be the case, really.
Yeah, definitely. One of the ways that it manifests itself is through education. It like teaches you that, there's a certain way that's correct and a different way. For example, in the academic space, when you're writing a paper, more often than not, you're asked to cite an academic source. But it's like, no, like I can still get credible information from a conversation with my grandmother.
Exactly.
And that's something that, we don't really think of as like part of coloniality, but in reality it is. It's a major part of it. And just to sort of bridge this conversation and move us a little bit further along, another very key part of coloniality is the way that we view tribe.
Oh yeah,
this like rigid thing,
Yeah,
and in the past, right? Mm-hmm. Africa was characterized by pluralism, flexibility, and multifaceted identity. And then after colonialism, it's like, no, you are this, you are Lozi, you are Tonga, you are Bemba, you are Chewa, that's all. And it's like, no, that's not how it is. And, we've talked about this in the migrations, and that's, that's prior to the colonial era. That's what our society is like. And that's what it is like today still. But then we still have this construct that hangs over our heads and is like a noose around our neck.
Yeah, that is true, because I think the colonial era really aggravated those differences, especially of tribalism. This wasn't a problem before that. But now, after these people come, the Europeans come, and then now people start to see, oh, okay, so now we're even different. And then there are so many boundaries. Of course, boundaries, also being drawn from the migration, in terms of settlement. But then I think at that point, it wasn't really political as compared to what it became, during and after colonial rule, because now this was more evident and people just wanted to identify as themselves. And now this is still a problem like today, which really wasn't the case. I think we were okay, like you said, being multifaceted and just in different places coexisting. But now I feel like there's this this urge to, like isolate and just, identify as a particular thing that sometimes when somebody else, wants to identify you with another, tribe, it's like, no, don't do that because this is just my tribe. Like, where did that come from? So I think all that really just made everything like very crazy.
Yeah, I mean, that's very true. That's very interesting to note. But also, I guess maybe not to be too pessimistic. To our credit, I mean, from a linguistic perspective, it's normal for a Zambian to be fluent in many different languages, depending on where you are. Like, in Lusaka, most often you speak Nyanja, and on the Copper Belt, obviously, one of the more common languages is Bemba, and that sort of transcends. Like when you migrate into a different area, you typically will pick up the language pretty quickly and assimilate into that linguistic culture. So that's, to our credit, I feel like we do try to push that, and more often than not, the tribal division is pushed by politicians, I think.
Okay, I think fair enough. I mean, I totally get what you're saying, but language, again, when we talk about like the linguistic side, again, this was used by the Western powers, just to divide our territories, like in our country, and just create new identities. I think that, I mean, of course, I'm not trying to be pessimistic, but I think we also cannot run away from the fact that there were different, languages spoken and whatnot. And then comes the Western powers saying, like English should be, the norm. I mean, English is even like our official language as well, but I think it also just brought out those differences, that division in terms of, our territories linguistically, and also creating new identities, because again, now it's like, I think that's still evident, honestly. When we talk about linguistic side, like the linguistic area, that's still a thing, like today, So
yeah, I guess, I mean, yeah, no, I definitely, it's one of those. It's an oxymoron, really. It's a huge paradox. Yeah. It's like, okay, do we choose to speak English, the language of our colonizer, or do we decide that to each their own and have 73 different languages?
Yeah.
So, because like we could go the route of like a place like South Africa where they have several official languages, but it's like at some point, a certain language gets excluded. So how do we solve this problem? And that's a big struggle for us, and
it is.
We'll see how it goes from there.
It really is.
But again, interestingly, we also have seen the rise of like a dominant Zambian culture, I think, in the sense, and two things kind of come to mind in this. One of them is the attendance of traditional ceremonies. We have people, from all parts of the country going to different ceremonies in so many different places. Kulamba, Kuomboka, Mtomboko, Nchwala, Shimunenga, just to name a few, like off the top of my head. People go there even though they're not specifically from those regions where these ceremonies are happening. And so it's like, it's embraced as like a Zambian traditional ceremony rather than a ceremony for this tribe that happens to, exist in Zambia. And then you also look at, Bemba customs like Chilangamlilo, Mateweto and stuff. And like, you have people from all across the country adopting these customs.
Yeah.
And so it feels like, we're getting to a point where sooner rather than later, we're going to embrace everything. And it's like, you find yourself having urban schools, having elective courses on various Zambian languages. Like you don't have to be in Solwezi to learn languages like Lunda, Luvale, and whatnot.
Yeah.
So
I think
yeah,
that would be very interesting.
Yeah, I suppose there's still hope, I suppose, in that sense. And
yeah. And I think it's really up to us, to also just look forward to that and maybe just try to plant that, like in different generations. Because I feel like maybe, let's say the 90s group. Yeah, like I think we are people who are moving like that, like embracing, different cultures, because at the end of the day, we're Zambian. But then there are these kids who couldn't be bothered to, want to know about, their heritage and things like that. I think that's where the work really needs to be done. I think it should be intentional that, just like you said, some of these, like structures are just put in place so that the generations that are coming, have that place to learn, like the Zambian aspect generally, without segregating or without isolating one from the other. I think that's very important. It really calls for a lot of intention, a lot of intentionality in just making that possible.
Yeah, most definitely. But it's one of those things that I guess we work on over time and over generations, because I feel like for the most part, the next generation won't quite feel a strong inclination to a tribe rather than to the country, to their family. And like most families in Zambia today are extremely blended. Like I don't know, I don't know. Like you have ancestry from all over the country through intermarriage, through migration, resettlement, and all that. And so the next generation probably has the best opportunity to resolve this sort of problem that we find ourselves in the middle of right now.
Yeah, I hear you. I hear that. That is true.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I think we're coming towards the end of this. I mean, it's not been completely exhaustive. There's a lot more depth to go into, but we kind of just wanted to get this conversation started. I'm sure that we'll be back. Hopefully, we'll be back with Zangi collaborating on different topics in the future. But yeah, real quick, I just want to give Zangi an opportunity to give her remarks, and also plug yourself, Zangi. Tell our audience about your podcast and anything that you wanna put out for yourself.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you so much for having me, you guys. I really love every opportunity to learn, and just to converse with like-minded people. And just the fact that October is very, very special to me. It's very, very close to my heart. I'm so grateful that I got to collaborate with you. And I look forward to just listening in, and possible, collaborations in the future, especially about history and just things that pertain to, just upwardness, getting better, like just for the general, the general good, so to say. Otherwise, please listen to my podcast when you have chance. I'm on Anchor and Zangi Mumber, and I just have different content, and just looking forward to, having different guests on there as well. But I'm sure you learn something, because I'm usually looking forward, to just displaying practical things, practical experiences, and just give a perspective of that. So please go and listen to one or two podcasts and let me know what you think. Otherwise, thank you for having me. It's been such a pleasure and an honor to be here.
All right, awesome. Well, thank you for collaborating with us. We've learned a lot from you, and we look forward to more in the future. With that being said, to all our listeners all across the globe, if you're listening on Rovert Radio, first of all, shout out Rovert Radio. Or if you're listening on Anchor, Spotify, Google Podcasts, wherever, just shout out to you too. Thank you for tuning in. This is The Village ZM. Happy Zambia History Month. And yeah, we will catch you in the next segment. We have a few more exciting segments coming up. And yeah, all I can say, I guess, just to close this off for now is, let's be kind to each other. Let's treat each other with respect and dignity, and always remember that, we have an opportunity to build a society that transcends time. So let's work together. Let's not try to exploit each other. We can definitely build something great as a people, and so let's tap into that opportunity. Drops mic.